why should we read Smith today as opposed to just cite him or bringing him in one side or the other? And I look at possible answers. One is, well, because his policy prescription. And if we look at his policy prescription, then we know that, or we can think that his policy prescription are not exactly the reason why we should read him. Mostly because this is, for example, a citation from 1976. And most of you may not even have been born by then. But at that time, which is for the 200th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations, the Smithian principles of free competition were developed against a particular historical background. The Smithian word has been changed behind recognition. And you think about what that means, the fact that the Smith's word has been changed beyond recognition. Smith writes, again, 1776, The Wealth of Nations, at the peak of the British Empire. Today, Britain is not an empire anymore. Today, Britain is trying to leave the European Union, among other things. Smith wrote in a time in which there is no central bank, is giving policy prescription for a time in which there is commodity money, not fiat money. And today we have Adam Smith's face printed on a 20 pounds bill printed by a central bank, which is fiat money. Okay. Smith lived in a time in which democracy was completely absent. And today we live in countries in which there is more or less democracy. Policy prescription that Smith offers are not appropriate for our times because our times are so institutionally different that make no sense to try to implement them in our times. So if we try to read Smith because of his policy prescription, then I think we are going to have some issues, and that may not be the best. Then we say, okay, forget policy prescription. We can read Smith because, after all, Smith is the father of economics. So we can read Smith because of his economic principles, of economic analysis. Well, this is what Cannon wrote in 1926 for the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. 126, and none of us were born, probably not even your parents. Maybe your grandparents, but not sure. And Cannon is the editor of The Wealth of Nations, is the most important person that you relate to when you think of The Wealth of Nations. And this is what Cannon said about The Wealth of Nations. Very little of Adam Smith's scheme of economics has been left standing by subsequent inquiries. No one, in 1926, no one holds his theory of value. His account of capital is seen to be hopelessly confused, and his theory of distribution is explained as an ill-assorted union between his own theory of prices and the physiocrat's fanciful economic table. His classification of income is found to involve a misguided attempt to alter the ordinary useful and well-recognized meaning of words and a mixing up of classification according to source with classification according to method of manner of receipt. His opinion about taxation and his incidents are extremely crude, and his history is based on insufficient information and disfigured by bias. Now, for the professors among you, would you use a textbook that is considered in those terms? Okay. So maybe if we want to think of The Wealth of Nations as, if we want to read The Wealth of Nations because of its economic analysis, we have to rethink about it. At least according to Cannon. And again, and if this was true in 1926, imagine today how true this could be. So we're now going to read Wealth of Nations because of his policy prescription, hopefully. We're not going to read The Wealth of Nations because of his economic analysis, hopefully. Then we can read it because of his ideological positions. And that is also a bad reason to read The Wealth of Nations. Because if you are right-leaning, then you're going to be quite disappointed. And if you are left-leaning, you're going to be even more disappointed. So Jim Buchanan says that if Adam Smith were alive today, he would be a long distance from the modern libertarian anarchist, even from this espousal of the minimal state described by Robert Nozick. So if you're looking for an ideological justification for libertarianism, The Wealth of Nations is not the place to go. Because Adam Smith does not believe in libertarian anarchism in any forms of way. The role of the state is predominant. So not even the minimal state applies. The role of the state is big. You can't separate the state from the economy. On the other hand, Smith has very strong attacks against capitalists in the sense of that there are a lot of things that you can read as proto-class struggle, and definitely attacks against big merchant manufacturers that are lobbyists that do what is good for them and squeeze the poor people. So you can read it as an anti-capitalist book. But if you are from the left, I mean, after all, Smith is considered like the ground for Marxism. So it's not that uncommon to think of Smith as a father of the left as well, of Marxism as well. And yet, if you are from the left, you look at Smith and say, not quite. So it's not anti-capitalist enough from the left, and is not libertarian enough from the right. So if you're looking at, if you want to read Smith to find some ideological justification of your current position, that's not the right place to look at. So why read Smith, The Wealth of Nations? And in a completely different context, Roy Weintraub, which is an historian of economics at Duke University, I asked him if he could comment on a paper that I've written. And he said, yes, of course. And said, Maria, you know what? I think there was a different paper, it was a completely different thing. So, but you're realizing what you're saying is that Adam Smith is like the Bible. And I'm like, am I? So yes. You're saying that Smith is the Bible. It's like, not the Bible, but like the Bible. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, yes, you are. And maybe we should read The Wealth of Nations, if Roy is correct, because Adam Smith is like the Bible, because The Wealth of Nations is like the Bible. In the following sense, it is a living book. So the Bible, if you take it literally, you have some issues, right? So because it describes a context that is different from ours. And yet, even if you take it literally, you're able to extract some meanings that can be applied to today. So in this sense, the Bible is an eternal book because it's a living book. It's a book that even if the words stay the same, adapts itself to different circumstances. And so Roy is thinking that Smith can be read as a living book, as the Bible is. So that could be a good reason to read Adam Smith, because The Wealth of Nations is a living book just like the Bible is. But if you're not happy with this interpretation, we have another one. Hugo da Gama Cerqueira is a Brazilian economist, historian of economics. And when I asked him this question, like, why should I read Adam Smith? He said, well, maybe you should think of The Wealth of Nations as in the same way as what Italo Calvino defines as a classic. Since you're Italian, you should know. But since I'm Italian, I don't know. So I had to look up what Italo Calvino's definition of classic is. And here's one definition. A classic is a book which with each rereading offer as much of a sense of discovery as the first reading. So you read a book once and you say, whoa, there's a lot in here. You read it twice and it's like, whoa, there's still a lot in here. You read it 3 times, it's like, oh, there's still more in here. Right? So every time you read it, there's still a new discovery. And I think that is a good definition of The Wealth of Nations. Another definition of classic that Calvino gives is that a classic is a book which has never exhausted all it had to say to its readers. And again, I think that does apply to The Wealth of Nations. Because there's always something in it, something new that you didn't get the first time around. Or that somebody else reads and sees something that you haven't seen before. And then there is another definition, which is the one that I like the most, that Calvino gives of a classic that I think applies to The Wealth of Nations, which is a classic is a term given to any book which comes to represent the whole universe. Like it. A book on par with an ancient talisman. So I like this definition. So there's a typo, but that's okay. I take this definition as a good definition or a good reason to read Adam Smith, because The Wealth of Nations can be seen as representing the whole universe like an ancient talisman. Why? Why am I willing to say that The Wealth of Nations is like an ancient talisman that represents the whole universe? Because I think that The Wealth of Nations is a book about ideas. It's not a book about ideology. It's not a book about policy prescriptions. It's not a book about economics. It's a book about ideas. More than that, it's a book about big ideas. And it's a book that asks big questions. It's not just questions. It's a book that asks big questions. And asks the still question that we are asking today. If you think of the name of The Wealth of Nations, it's not The Wealth of Nations. The book is actually titled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. We shorten it to Wealth of Nations because we are lazy. But the actual title is an inquiry. It's not a theory. It's not a system. It's not principles. It's an inquiry. It's a book that asks questions. It doesn't necessarily give you the answers or the right answers, but it does ask questions. In his time, it was abbreviated as an inquiry, by the way. But you're saying, well, Maria, but today in economics, we ask questions too. If you don't have a question, you don't have a paper, you don't have a publication. And indeed, all the American Economic Review's papers, which are, the American Economic Review is the most important journal in economics, are all based on questions. So, for example, the evolving choice inconsistency in choice of prescription drug insurance. Those are the kind of questions that create papers for the economic, this is an actual title, in the American Economic Review. Like, okay, yeah, we do ask questions today, but what kind of question do we ask? Smith asks, what are the nature and causes of the wealth of nations? The scope of the question is slightly different. It's a great question, the one that we read in the American Economic Review, don't take me wrong. But it's a question that once I answer it today, I'm like, okay, cool, I'm done. Will I be reading 250 years from now the paper that is titled An Evolving Choice Inconsistency in Choice of Prescription Drug Insurance? Would you be interested 250 years from, not you personally, but your future you, would you rather read Evolving Choice Inconsistency in Prescription Choice Drug Insurance, or what are the causes and the nature of the wealth of nations? The nature of the questions, the scope of the question is different. This is why I was saying before, it's not just about ideas that the wealth of nations is about. It's not just about questions, it's about big ideas, about big questions. We ask questions today, we have ideas today, but our ideas today are this big. Smith ideas are this big. Or these questions are this big. So we care about the questions, not about the answer. And this is why it's okay if his economics is all over the place, it makes nonsense. It's okay if his policy prescriptions are completely inadequate for today's. Because we don't care about the implementation of those policy prescriptions. What we care for are the questions that generate those policy prescriptions. The policy prescription will adapt to our own environment, but the questions are still the same. And this is what I think some of the question, if not the question, that the Wealth of Nations is asking. How would that just system, which is also promoting the well-being of humankind, look like? Given the imperfect and non-perfectible nature of humankind. I'm emphasizing how would a just system look like that also promotes well-being of humankind, not vice versa. It's not how does a system that promotes well-being and, by the way, also justice, but is how would a just system also promote the well-being of humankind? Given that we are not perfect, not perfect and not perfectible. And once we have this system, if we do have it, how can we preserve it? So we have a system that is going to have something to do with wealth. So why do we care about wealth? Why is wealth important? Why is wealth somehow related to a just system that promotes well-being of individuals, given that we are not perfectible? Why wealth? What is so important about wealth? I think that the answer comes from not necessarily Smith himself, but also from it himself. But this gives you a sense of what I was saying, that the question that we are asking today are the same that the question that Smith asks. Ulysses is an artist from rural Brazil. I met Ulysses as I was going to a conference in the middle of the mountains of Brazil. And he was selling his art outside the conference location. And among the things that he was selling was this thing. And I was puzzled because it's like, what is this? Because it's a woman on a cross. So it's not just a regular cross. It's a woman on a cross. And I've never seen a woman crucified. So I asked him, like, what is this thing? And Ulysses I don't think he has any education. I don't think he has ever heard of Adam Smith. I don't think he doesn't know anything about economics at all. So I'm not sure that he knows how to read and write. He had few teeth, but he has like this artistic spirit. So I asked him, what is this? And he said, well, I wanted to represent the suffering that we are experiencing here in rural Brazil. Because we are forgotten by the government, we are forgotten by everybody, and we struggle every day to stay alive. Our poverty is immense. We are farmers, and if you notice on the cross, there are the tools for farming. We're fighting every day to try to produce what is necessary for our life, but our poverty is overwhelming. Women are suffering more than anybody. And this particular woman is crucified to represent the suffering that our condition creates, the little angel on the side is her baby. Because she gave birth, but the baby died immediately because she wasn't able to provide the care that the baby needed to survive. And there is an angel because the baby was born immediately after he was born, and so he goes directly to heaven. And so Ulysses wanted to transmit the suffering and the poverty of rural Brazil is experiencing. A suffering that kills infants, and a suffering that goes across everybody, so much so that kills not just infants, but put everybody on a cross. Ulysses, I think, was talking about exactly the same problem that Adam Smith is talking about. So Ulysses never read Adam Smith. I don't think he knew who Adam Smith was, and yet is asking exactly the same questions that Smith is asking. This is how Adam Smith starts The Wealth of Nations. This is his own introduction of The Wealth of Nations. He tells us why should we read The Wealth of Nations? Why should we care? He says, Smith, some countries are so miserably poor that from mere want, they are frequently reduced, or at least think themselves reduced, to the necessity sometimes of directly destroying and sometimes of abandoning their infants, their old people, and those afflicted by lingering diseases to perish with hunger or to be devoured by wild beasts. You are so poor in some countries, that you are forced to destroy your children, your elderly, and your sick. I know Yolanda has some children, so I'm going to use you for one more time. Imagine that you give birth to your daughter and you have to leave her to be devoured by a wild beast. Are your grandparents alive? Yes? Old? Healthy? More or less? What if you had to leave them outside to be exposed to the elements because you can't take care of them? Those are very difficult things that you're forced to do because you have no choice. Because you know that if you try to keep your child alive, or your grandparents alive, or your sick people alive, you are not going to make it. Your resources are so limited that you have to choose whether an healthy person stays alive or a sick person dies. You can't have both staying alive because you're so poor. This is exactly what Ulysses is talking about here. This mother saw her child die because she couldn't take care of him. She didn't have enough resources to support the life of his baby, which is exactly what Smith says, that we are forced to abandon our infant because we are so miserably poor. And this is why wealth is important. Because if you are so miserably poor and you are one of the weakest in society, you will suffer, and you will unjustly suffer. On the other hand, this is how it starts, The Wealth of Nations. And this is the introduction of The Wealth of Nations. At the very end of the first chapter of The Wealth of Nations, it says, in a rich country, a poor worker can live better than an African king. An African king is, the language at this time is whatever it is, but is the stereotype of a poor environment. And note also that the African king is the absolute master of the lives and liberties of 10,000 naked savages. So not only a poor worker in a rich country is able to live better than an African king. But an African king is also the master of the lives and liberties of 10,000 other people. And that is not a situation that you're going to have in a country that is commercial and has wealth. So what are the institutions that channel our passion to promote justice and wealth? For Smith, those institutions that are based on our natural propensity to track, barter, and exchange, and our division of labor. The institutions that are based on our natural propensity to track, barter, and exchange are the institutions that evolved from what he calls the silent revolution of commerce. Are institution that destroys the servile dependency of the feudal system. We just saw the African king is the master of the lives and liberties of 10,000 people. There is a dependency if there is a master and servant, because the servant depends on the master for their life. That dependency is servile, and that dependency is broken when you introduce commerce. At the very beginning of the Wealth of Nations, Smith tells us that we get our dinner from the baker, the butcher, and the brewer. How do we get that dinner? By buying it. The alternative from buying our dinner from the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, Smith tells us, is to get dinner like dogs do, by fawning at the feet of their masters. You can get dinner by fawning at the feet of your master and be like a dog in a servile dependency, not out of your choice, of course, because the master is putting you and is treating you like a dog. Or you can be dignified and put at the same level of the master and trade with them and trade with whomever gives you dinner. So the dignity of human beings is going to be brought up because you're not in servile dependency anymore. You become free of that dependency as well as wealthy. And that is what the silent revolution of commerce brings about. Smith is not Pollyanna. Smith is not naive, though. He's also aware that with wealth there comes problems. With commerce comes wealth, and wealth generates problems. Part of the problems that wealth generates is that you have a very large pot of wealth that can be taken. If there's poverty, there's nothing to take. If there is wealth, the wealth can be taken. And can be taken through lobbying, through special interest groups. Special interest group can lobby the government to get a larger share, which is unjust. So Smith defines the wealth of nations in his own writing. He says the wealth of nations is a violent attack against the whole commercial system of Great Britain. Because it's an attack against the clamor of big merchants and manufacturers. Big merchants and manufacturers, they are lobbying, there are special interest groups that are trying to get monopoly privileges for their own benefits at the expense of the whole society, which is, again, unjust for me. Because you're gaining at the expense of other. And anybody who gains at the expense of other is doing something that is unjust. It is inefficient as well. But Smith's first priority is the injustice of the system. This is a comment that James Buchanan gave about the Wealth of Nations, which I subscribe, and I think is one of the reasons why the Wealth of Nations is still a book to be read today. Adam Smith considered the wealth of nations to be a demonstration of the system of natural liberty, which emerged from fundamentally normative criteria of justice, could also meet efficiency criteria. Again, the priority is justice, then also happens to be efficient. But the system of natural liberty is a just system, and that is what matters. The efficiency of it is only a side effect. It's great that is also efficient, but justice is a priority. Smith Buchanan says, may well have conceived this masterpiece to be an argument to the effect that the system which was acknowledged to embody justice could also be efficient. Ulysses doesn't know anything about efficiency. He knows about justice and injustice, and that's what he cares. And if it happens to be efficient, the better. But the priority, again, is justice. And for Smith, whatever is just is always efficient. It's not always the case that what is efficient is just, but what is just is always efficient. The other thing that I think is relevant is that today we tend to think of a distinction between policy and economy. It's just like two different islands that do not interact. Occasionally, if you think in terms of political economy, you can think of those two islands and the bridge, but they're two separate islands. I think instead that for Smith, what it would be more appropriate to think is entangled political economy, to use a research program that Richard Wagner has established. So rather than thinking of policy and economy as two separate islands, you think of the two as being intertwined, and you can't separate the two. So this is how Smith describes the emergence of commercial society and the fall of the feudal system. Commerce and manufacturers gradually introduce order and good government. And with them, the liberty and security of individuals among the inhabitants of the country, who had before lived almost in a constant state of war with their neighbors and of servile dependency, again, upon their superior. But commerce and manufacture, notice that there is no wealth here. What commerce and manufacture are introducing is order, good government, liberty, and security. Yes, it also happens to introduce wealth. But what is most relevant for him is what Hume recognized, and he cites in Hume on this, is order and good government with liberty and security. The two cannot be separated. So why should we read The Wealth of Nations? I think we should read The Wealth of Nations because it's a work with big ideas, it's a work that asks big questions, regardless of whether you agree with their answers. It is a book that tells us as well to trust the silent revolution of commerce and competition, the forms of which you can argue about. Yet, the big question and the big ideas are all related to trusting the silent revolution of commerce and competition. Thank you.